End of quote. Well intended. The Gang of Eight called for a robust floor debate. They said they supported regular order. So I asked them, do they think that having only considered 9 amendments equates to a robust and open process?
The Senator yield for a question.
I'll yield to her question. I may not answer, but I'll yield for it.
Not the fact that the First Amendment that was brought up on here was a bipartisan one of mine and Senator Hatch. Shortly thereafter, the senator from Iowa came with an amendment. Following the normal courtesy he'd done, I allowed mine to be set aside so he could bring up his. But isn't it a fact that then when we asked if he might set that aside for some non-controversial amendments on either side, he told me he could not.
The senator is correct.
Thank you.
We only had 9 amendments. Is that a robust and open process? Do they think that the majority has allowed regular order? From my point of view, the answer is a clear and resounding no. And now we're at a point where the process is halted. It's unclear if any more amendments will be debated and voted on. The only amendment that is in order is the one that was concocted behind closed doors and is loaded full of provisions that are shockingly close to what can be called earmarks. We're back where we started, with a gang of members promising that their legislative text is the best thing to happen to immigration reform, that their solution is the end of future illegal immigration. Does anyone really think that this will solve the problem once and for all? From my point of view, based upon my experience in 1986 and since, the answer is a clear and resounding no. There's fundamental flaws in this amendment that we call the Schumer-Hoeven-Corker Amendment, legalization first. I'm going to take the opportunity to walk through some changes. The authors claim the amendment is a border surge that leaves no more doubt about whether the border will be secured. Yet the border changes only account for about half of the total amendment. There are changes to every title. There are changes to exchange visitor program, the future guest worker program, and visas for the performing arts. This isn't just a border amendment. There are provisions in the bill to attract other senators to support its passage. I'll dive into those provisions in detail in just a moment, but first I want to focus on border measures. The sponsors of this bill want you to believe that it's different from the 1986 legislation. They say it'll be tough and expensive road. It'll be easier for individuals just to go home than to go through the process. What the sponsors don't like to admit is that the bill is legalization first, enforcement later, and I have to add enforcement later, if ever. Take, for example, the fact that one of the sponsors who went on Spanish television tried to apologize for speaking the truth. He said, quote, "Let's be clear. Nobody's talking about preventing legalization. The legalization is going to happen. That means the following will happen. First comes the legalization. Then comes a measure to secure the border. And then comes a process of permanent residence," end of quote. Now, he spoke the truth. And the fundamental flaw underlying the bill has not changed with this amendment. So let's be clear. No one is preventing the legalization. It's going to happen, as opposed to the promise when this bill was put forward that the bill was going to secure the border first. Now, there's a lot of money in this bill. There's a lot of micromanaging in this amendment, and there are more waivers. And remember, this is already on top of, I think one member counted 222 waivers for the Secretary. So we write a piece of legislation. We're supposed to legislate, but we legislate and then say to the Secretary, well, you can ignore what we legislate in certain conditions. We ought to be making broad policy here and not delegating to the administration. the way that we too often do, not just in this legislation, but just as a matter of fact on most everything. What the amendment does is require more boots on the ground. It increases the presence of Border Patrol, even though the member of the Gang 8 have long opposed that idea. They said it was unnecessary and costly. But let's be honest with the American people. The amendment may call for more Border Patrol agents, but it doesn't require it until the undocumented population, who are now called RPIs, apply for adjustment of status or a green card. So it's legalization first, border security long down the road. I'm all for putting more agents on the border, but why wait? Why allow legalization now and simply promise more agents in the future? And even then, who really believes that the Secretary, like the one we have today, will actually enforce the law? Then there's the fencing. One of the conditions that must be met before the Secretary can produce green cards for people here illegally is that the southern border fencing strategy has been submitted to Congress and implemented. This fencing strategy will identify where 700 miles of pedestrian fencing is in place. Note that this is not double-layered, as in current law. The amendment states that a second layer is to be built only if, quote, the Secretary deems necessary and appropriate. Now, can the authors of this amendment say that that's a promise to the American people to build fence if somehow the Secretary is given the authority of whether or not it's necessary or appropriate? Additionally, the underlying bill still specifically states that nothing in this provision shall be interpreted to require her to install fencing. The amendment also requires that an electronic entry-exit system is in use at all international air and seaports, but only, quote, where U.S. Customs and Border Protection are currently deployed, end of quote. This is actually weaker than the bill that came before the United States Senate just a few weeks ago. And that bill required that an electronic entry-exit system be in use at air and sea ports, not just internationally. It is still weaker than current law, which requires biometric entry and exit at all ports of entry, including air, sea, and land. And that current law has been on the books for a long period of time, not carried out by both Republican and Democrat administrations. So what certainty do you have that this is going to be carried out? The Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment border proposal adds technology in addition to manpower at the southern border. It authorizes the Secretary to purchase and deploy certain border equipment. I'll give you some examples that are included in this amendment. In Arizona, the Secretary is allowed to deploy 50 fixed towers, 73 fixed camera systems, 28 mobile surveillance systems, 685 unattended ground sensors, and 22 handheld equipment devices, including night vision goggles. In San Diego, the Secretary is allowed to deploy the same type of equipment, but different quantities. They also will deploy non-intrusive inspective systems, a radiation portal monitor, a littoral detection and clarification network. In El Centro, California, the Secretary is allowed to deploy the same equipment, but the list also includes 2 sensor repeaters, 2 communication repeaters. They will also get 5 fiber optic tank inspection scopes, a license plate reader, a backscatter, 2 portable contraband detectors, 2 radiation isotope identification devices, 8 radiation isotope identification device updates, 3 personal radiation detectors, and 16 mobile automated targeting systems. Now, that's not at all. The list goes on. It includes certain helicopters and aircraft aircraft upgrade. It includes 10 Black Hawk helicopters, 30 Marine vessels. I'd like to know what some of these items are. Who provided the amendment sponsors with this list? We had a hearing in January, and not once did the list appear. Secretary Napolitano did not provide the committee with any list. Did Sikorsky, Cessna, Northrop Grumman send up a wish list to certain members of the Senate? So while the Senate micromanages what technology is to be purchased and deployed, we should take note that the bill allows the Secretary to, quote-unquote, reallocate the personnel, infrastructure, and technologies laid out. So it's pretty simple. A secretary who says the border's secure right now can change all of this stuff specifically specifically mentioned in this amendment. But let's also not forget about the litigation exception. The triggers or conditions may never have to be met. Green cards can be issued if the Supreme Court grants review of litigation on the constitutionality of the implementation of the conditions. Under the bill, if any court in this country issues a stay on implementing one of the conditions, then green cards are to be issued after 10 years. The bill does not specify what sort of ruling must prevent implementation or even that the ruling be on the merits, nor does the bill require that appeals run their course, even if the appeal upholds the conditions. Now, we still maintain this toothless commission called the Southern Border Security Commission, but it retools it a little bit, but still does not give it any teeth whatsoever. The amendment requires the creation of the commission 1 year after the enactment, which is probably better than the 5 years that are in the bill. They'd also be required to hold public hearings once a year. Under the original version of the bill, the commission would be in existence until they submitted a plan. Under this amendment, the commission will live for 10 years, yet the recommendations they provide still do not hold any weight. They can be ignored. There's non-binding. There's a lot of spending in this amendment as well. In addition to micromanaging the resources in each sector, the amendment increases taxpayer spending by $40 billion over the introduced version of the bill before this amendment was added to it. Originally, the legislation called for spending $100 million for startup costs and $6.5 billion for the Secretary to carry out the law. When we got to committee, there was a technical amendment that increased that startup cost from $100 million to $1 billion. During markup, Senator Schumer and his allies increased the trust fund allocation from $6.5 billion to $8.3 billion. Now this Schumer Corker-Hoeven amendment increases the trust fund to $46.3 billion. Now think, going from $8.3 billion to $46.3 billion. Add the $3 billion for the Secretary to have startup costs, and we're at $50 billion. That's over a 500% increase in spending. You know, a billion here and a billion there, and it soon adds up to real money. Note that this isn't shifting money from the trust fund like Senator Cornyn's amendment would have done, and that amendment was defeated here on the floor of the Senate. Instead, it's just plain old brand new spending. The sponsors found a money tree to pay for the wish list provided by Secretary Napolitano and the aerospace industry. Based on reports of how this deal was struck, we have a pretty good idea of why spending has increased. According to a Politico article from last week, negotiations for this deal were at a standstill until the Congressional Budget Office score was released. The CBO score stated that if this bill becomes law, it will cut the deficit by almost $1 trillion over the next 20 years. Thus, With this estimate in hand, the Political report tells us how the negotiators were able to find a solution, quote unquote, throw money at it. According to the article, it was suggested that senators could funnel some of the savings into border security. And that's what's been done. Again, as is often the case here in Washington, the solution has always seemed to be just throw more money at the problem. And the money has to come from somewhere. Furthermore, paying for the agents requires raiding the Social Security Trust Fund. Indeed, the bill sets aside $30 billion to pay for Border Patrol agents. But when asked on the floor how the Gang of Eight found the money, Senator Hoeven said he and Senator Corker were able to add the $30 billion in spending because CBO projects that S-744 will bring in more revenue than it requires in expenditures. But upon closer examination, it's clear that the projected revenue under CBO analysis is due to an increase in Social Security and Medicare taxes. This money must be set aside if Social Security and Medicare is to remain solvent. Thus, taking that tax revenue and using it for offense means raiding Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund. You know how the Medicare Trust Fund was raided for health care reform? Sounds like the same thing is happening here. On the date of enactment, the Treasury will transfer $46.3 billion to the trust fund. The sponsors claim that the Treasury will be repaid. But when will the funds be paid back to the Treasury? When will the American people be reimbursed? The sponsors of the bill saying that taxpayers won't bear the burden. Yet there's no requirement that the funds be paid back. There's no time limit or accountability to ensure that they're repaid. The Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment increases fees on the visas for illegal immigrants in order to replenish the trust fund and the Treasury. It happens that employers, students, and tourists will pay the price. The bill allows the Secretary to increase those fees so the employer who brings in high-skilled workers will bear the burden. Students and tourists who come in a legal way will bear the burden. But guess what? The amendment goes on to say that those who cross the border in violation of our laws says that the fees for those people cannot be charged more than what is allowed. The Secretary cannot adjust fees and penalties on those who apply for or renew RPI status or even blue card status. Now, there's no interior enforcement in here, and there's a real problem when you don't have more interior enforcement that's here. You're going to have more people coming here undocumented. The amendment in the underlying bill will not end undocumented immigration. The Congressional Budget Office reports that illegal immigration will only be reduced by 25% due to increased number of guest workers coming into the country. The amendment does nothing to radically reduce illegal immigration in the future and does not provide any resources to interior enforcement agencies whose mission it is to apprehend and detain and deport undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants. Just like with the 1986 legislation, we will be back in the same position 10 years facing the same problems. The amendment, for instance, in Section 1201, attempts to address people who overstay their visas. It says that the Secretary shall, 1, initiate removal proceedings, 2, confirm that immigration relief or protection has been granted or is pending, or 3, otherwise close 90% of the cases of non-immigrants who were admitted and extended their authorized period of admission by more than 180 days. So, while it appears to be tough on overstays, it only affects people who overstay their visa by 180 days or 6 months. It also allows the Secretary to close the cases. What does it mean for the Secretary to close these cases? Under current law, an immigration judge has the power to administratively close a case. It's used to temporarily remove a case from the calendar. Sometimes the judge waits for further action to be taken. And administrative closure is not a final order. Closure does not mean termination. It does not mean deportation. So I think it's unclear what this language does and who it's applying to. Moreover, it's unclear how the Secretary who would know who is overstayed if no exit data or tracking system exists. Also, why doesn't the amendment require the Secretary to deal with 100% of the people that overstay their period of authorization? Given there are no ramifications for the Secretary if she does not capture 90% of visa overstays, this is again another law that will not be followed. It does nothing to end this administration's anti-enforcement policies, but instead gives the Secretary of Homeland Security vast discretion to ignore serious criminal convictions of immigration violators, including gang-related crime, domestic violence, drunk driving, and child abuse. The bill would not only create an immediate legalization for those here legally today, but also a permanent legalization program for future undocumented immigrants. The Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment includes a provision that would make individuals admissible despite the 3 and 10-year bars. I'd like to know more about the rationale from the sponsors about why this language was included. There's no doubt that this amendment was crafted in the back rooms here on Capitol Hill, and there's really no secret that some of the members were able to insert provisions in the Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment while the rest of us attempted to work out an agreement on pending and filed amendments. While some of us were trying to legislate and bring up amendments for votes on the floor, others were taking advantage of the pay-to-play game. Clearly, some of the amendments filed were included. Let me share some examples. The amendment now authorizes funds for an educational campaign to help deter illegal crossings into Mexico from the south. This amendment would put American taxpayers' money towards training for law enforcement officials in Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and other countries. It would allow for taxpayers' expenditures to educate nationals of other countries, quote, about the perils of the journey to the United States, end of quote. This amendment should have been considered under regular order. The amendment now, number two, the amendment now includes a provision that would require Customs and Border Protection officials to reduce airport wait times. This amendment, which was filed, should have been considered under regular order. 3, the amendment now makes it harder for Border Patrol agents to enforce U.S. immigration law along the northern border by limiting the mileage or distance that agents can search vehicles or other forms of transportation. This amendment should have been filed, or which was filed, should have been considered under regular order. 4, the Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment includes an amendment number 1283 that creates a, quote, youth jobs fund, end of quote, using $1.5 billion from the U.S. Treasury to be repaid through fees. The goal of the fund is to, quote, provide summer and year-round employment opportunities for low-income youth, end of quote. This amendment should have been considered under regular order. The 5th, the Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment includes amendment number 1493, which designates zones 1, 2, and 3 occupations involving seafood processing in Alaska as shortage occupations. It also includes amendment number 1329, which extends the J visa summer work travel program to seafood processing positions only in Alaska. These amendments should have been considered under regular order. The 6th, the amendment now includes amendment number 1183, which was actually pending before the Senate. It would allow for fee waivers on certain visa holders, namely O and P non-immigrants, who come to the United States to work in Hollywood or play professional sports. We could have voted on this and had regular order on that amendment. Well, there's a lot more amendments you could go through. I'd like to just suggest some clarifying amendments. And there probably should be more clarifying amendments. The amendment by Schumer, Hoeven, and Corker also includes so-called technical fixes. One fix is related to H-1B visa caps. The sponsors of the bill and those who work behind closed doors to devise an H-1B visa package stated that the annual cap would not exceed $180,000. Yet the language didn't do what they said it did. As written, it provided $20,000 more than they claimed. So this amendment includes a clarification to say that the cap shall not exceed $180,000. The second clarifying change in the amendment is related to visas for countries that have entered the free trade agreements with the United States. During committee consideration, the senator from New York added an amendment that would provide 10,500 visas for countries in the African Growth and Opportunity Act and the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act. The change in this amendment clarifies that only a total of 10,500 may go to those countries rather than to each country that is described under the Act. Still, it's not 100% clear what the clarification achieves, if that clarification achieves the goal. So it's legitimate with these clarifications and fixes. How many more clarifying amendments are necessary? These two provisions were included because my staff caught them and brought them to the sponsor's attention. But how many more provisions are not written properly that they don't know about? So, at the end of the day, the Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment doesn't do what the sponsors say it will. As we have seen all along, we're being promised one thing and sold another. I'm frustrated with how the majority has processed this bill. We could have had 3 genuine weeks on this bill, processing amendments and having votes, yet we're forced to vote on packages that were concocted behind closed doors. We were given 72 hours to read the legislative text. That may be plenty of time to read it, but it's not plenty of time to actually study it and know what's in it. Even then, the American people would have had a difficult time getting their hands on the bill over the weekend or understanding its true ramifications. It's quite obvious that I'm going to vote against this amendment. It does nothing to change the legalization first philosophy and offers little more than false promises that the American people can no longer tolerate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask consent that I be allowed to speak as in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, for more and without delaying or affecting the time of the cloture vote today.
Without objection.
Mr. President, for more than a decade, the government's ability and authority to gather information and electronic communications data about those who are suspected of or connected to potential terrorists have greatly increased. You only have to read the newspaper or listen to the news and realize how extraordinary this expansion has been. But as an American, I feel if the government is going to have such powerful authorities, it should only be if there is proper oversight and accountability and transparency. We have to ensure we maintain both our nation's security, but the fundamental civil liberties upon which our nation was founded. I've long been troubled by the expansive nature and scope of the USA Patriot Act and the FISA Amendments Act. There is not enough oversight an ability for Americans to know just what it is their government is doing and be able to get into the debate of whether they want their government to do this. That's why I've consistently fought to include strong protections for the privacy rights and civil liberties of American citizens, but also sunsets to help ensure proper congressional oversight. Nothing focuses oversight like knowing that a law is about to come to an end. And so I will introduce today, at the end of my remarks, along with a bipartisan group of senators, the FISA Accountability and Privacy Protection Act of 2013. In fact, of those of us who are introducing this, we go across the political spectrum. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. This is an issue of saying we want to know what our government is doing and why. And as Americans, we have the right to know what our government does and why. In each of the last two Congresses, I introduced legislation to improve and reform the powerful law enforcement tools of the USA Patriot Act, but at the same time, increasing judicial oversight, public accountability, and transparency. Now, both those bills were reported favorably by the Judiciary Committee with bipartisan support, but then ultimately Congress decided to extend all of these authorities without any modifications or improvements until 2015. Likewise, when Congress considered reauthorizing the FISA Amendment Act last year, I pushed for a shorter sunset, greater transparency for the American people, and better oversight. I regret the Senate rejected these efforts to apply stricter oversight over these sweeping authorities. Now, the recent revelations about two classified data collection programs have brought renewed attention to the government's broad surveillance authorities, but they also underscore the need for close scrutiny by Congress. The Director of National Intelligence has acknowledged that they are being conducted pursuant to Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act and Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act. We've also raised some questions about lax oversight by NSA when a 29-year-old contract employee can walk off with huge amounts of data without being stopped. You know, it's not enough for them to come here and say we're doing this to protect the country. I'd like them to kind of protect some of the things that they're already holding. So the comprehensive legislation I'm introducing today will not only improve the privacy protections and accountability provisions associated with these authorities, it's going to strengthen oversight and transparency provisions in other parts of the USA Patriot Act. In recent days, much attention has been rightly focused on Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the bulk collection of phone call metadata by the National Security Agency, and their inability to keep that from being stolen by, again, as I said, a 29-year-old contract worker. This measure will narrow the scope of Section 215 orders by requiring the government to show both relevance to an authorized investigation and a link to a foreign group or power. The bill also has more meaningful judicial review of Section 215 orders, but strikes the one-year waiting period before a recipient can challenge a nondisclosure order for Section 215 orders. Now, the order comes in, and you're told, but you can't talk about it. No matter whether it damages your business, your relations, or people that you're supposed to protect, you can't talk about it for a year. That's a broad generalization of what the nondisclosure orders are. I think those should be changed. I think that when you have these kind of gag orders on Americans, you're going into a very, very dangerous area. Moreover, this measure would require court review of minimization procedures when information concerning a U.S. person is acquired or retained or disseminated pursuant to a Section 215 order. This is a common-sense oversight requirement already required for other FISA authorities such as wiretaps of physical searches, pen register, trap, and trace devices. I likened it before, Mr. President, we all understand if a law enforcement agency gets a search warrant to go into your home and search for things, you usually know about it. And you're able to question authority and why and so on. Now, if they're going in and collecting things electronically, you don't know about it. You don't know what this is doing to your reputation, to your work, or anything else. We have to have more accountability. The FISA Accountability and Privacy Protection Act will also reform and improve other authorities contained in the Patriot Act. Well, perhaps not a topic of recent public debate, and I will not go into some of those aspects here on the floor, but they significantly impact the privacy rights of Americans. Now, some of the things we can talk about, things like national security letters, so-called NSLs, they're used extensively by law enforcement and the intelligence community. They can be issued without the approval of a court, a grand jury, or a prosecutor. Now, most Americans would be amazed to know that authority exists, and frankly, in a state like mine where people value their privacy, I think most Vermonters would be rather concerned about it. So I propose applying a new sunset to the NSL authority. That would require Congress to look at it again and come up with a better idea, or it ends right there. I've long been concerned about the broad scope of these secret requests, the potential for expansive collection of sensitive information without appropriate limitations. A sunset provision would help to ensure proper accountability. Mr. President, just because we can go out and gather all this information on Americans, often doing it secretly, doesn't mean we should. Some of us enjoy our privacy. Some of us like to think we're innocent unless proven guilty. My bill would also address constitutional deficiency regarding the non-disclosure of gag orders by finally allowing individuals to challenge these orders in court. You grow up with always hearing from everybody, well, you can have your day in court. Well, actually, you don't get your day in court with these gag orders. The bill would also expand public reporting the use of NSLs and FISA authorities, including an unclassified report on the impact of the use of these authorities on the privacy of U.S. persons. I have heard a great deal in the last few weeks from people not only in Vermont but elsewhere. Can't we have a report the American people can see, not just those of us who have, like myself, who have access to classified material, but have an unclassified report on the impact of the use of these authorities on the privacy of Americans. And my bill will also address shortcomings in the FISA Amendments Act. Applies improvements I sought during last year's reauthorization debate in the Senate. The existing December 2017 sunset would be shortened to June 2015 to focus everybody's attention, to ensure timely reexamination of how these authorities are being utilized. The June 2015 sunset will also align with the Patriot Act sunsets, allowing Congress, and in fact requiring Congress, to address all of these provisions at once, rather than a little piece here, a little piece there. It will also increase accountability. It will clarify the scope of annual reviews currently required by law, extending it to all agencies that have a role in developing, targeting, and the so-called minimization procedures. But finally, and I think this is extremely important, the bill seeks to increase oversight by requiring the Inspector General of the intelligence community to conduct a comprehensive review of the FISA Amendments Act and its impact on the privacy right of all Americans. Now, these are common sense, practical improvements that ensure that the broad and powerful surveillance tools being used by the government are subject to appropriate limitations, transparency, and oversight. The American people deserve to know how laws like the USA Patriot Act and the FISA Amendments Act are being used to conduct electronic surveillance, particularly when the surveillance is not just on those that we have reason to be suspicious of, but of all Americans, totally innocent Americans. American people deserve to know whether these programs have proven sufficiently effective to justify their extraordinary breadth. If you can collect billions of phone calls, well, we've proven technologically apparently you can do that, but do we get anything out of it? Or do we get our information about terrorists the old-fashioned way of actually talking to people and infiltrating terrorist groups and so forth? So let's make sure that we're not doing something just because we can do it, no matter how it impacts on the rights of Americans. The enhanced layers of transparency and oversight and accountability included in this legislation will ensure that we're protecting national security without undermining the privacy rights and civil liberties of law-abiding Americans. So I ask unanimous consent the text of the bill be printed in the record. And I introduce it. Bill to the desk on behalf of myself, Mr. Lee, Mr. Udall, Colorado, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Tester.
The bill will be received and appropriately referred.
Mr. President, as we go out of morning business, and I suggest you have some quorum with time equally divided.
Without objection, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Leahy was talking about introducing legislation dealing with the FISA court. The U.S. government has been collecting phone and internet data, which was allowed by the FISA court, and that was brought to light by National Security Agency leaker Edward Snowden. At the White House today, President Obama said the U.S. is following legal channels to bring Snowden back to the U.S. The Associated Press writes that Snowden is believed to be in Russia. Later on today at 5:30 Eastern, the Senate will hold a procedural vote that makes a range of changes to the immigration bill, including tying the permanent legal status created in the bill for illegal immigrants to border security. Senator Mike Johanns announced today that he'll oppose that 1,200-page amendment that was negotiated between Republicans and Democrats last week. In a statement, Senator Johanns outlined a few of his concerns, saying that in the amendment, illegal immigrants are almost immediately eligible for temporary legal status, and the $46.3 billion for border security is mandatory funding. But the amendment only requires $8.3 billion of that from fees, leaving the taxpayers on the hook for $38 billion. Those are the thoughts from Senator Johanns about that amendment, expected later this afternoon, a procedural vote at 5:30 Eastern. Again, the Senate this afternoon will hold a procedural vote at about 5:30 Eastern Time on that border surge amendment offered by senators last week. As we wait for a senator to speak, a look at how the safety net hospitals are affected by the 2010 health care law.
On Washington Journal, we continue our periodic Monday series looking at the federal health care law and its implementation. This morning, we focus on safety net hospitals and what the law will mean for their services and bottom line. Our guest is David Gruber, and he's with Alvarez and Marsal Healthcare Industry Group. He recently wrote a report on safety net hospitals. Good morning, sir. Thanks for joining us from New York. Start by telling us what a safety net hospital is.
Yeah, a safety net hospital is a hospital that serves a disproportionate number of uninsured and Medicaid. There are roughly 1,500 safety net hospitals in the United States. About half of those, about 500 or so, are deemed to be primary safety net hospitals, serving greater than 10% uninsured, and the remainder are called secondary safety net hospitals.
And we're talking about a mix of those owned publicly, not-for-profit. We're also looking at hospitals all over the country. Are there any other defining or universal characteristics?
Yeah, I mean, of the 1,500, probably 1,000 are government. Another 500 or so would be non-for-profit. You know, what we see is the average safety net hospital, you know, there are about 60% of them are in urban areas, 40% are in rural areas. They vary in size. The rural hospitals tend to be smaller, and the urban hospitals tend to be larger. A common attribute of all, though, is the population it serves. You know, a lot of uninsured, a lot of Medicaid populations.
And you can see here that some are publicly owned, although not all of them. As we also talked about, there are some that are not-for-profits, and then we see a division of those urban and rural, and half of those have less than 100 beds. So how do these hospitals make money?
Well, they're not in the business of making money. I mean, they're in the business of providing care, irrespective of the ability of patients to pay for that care. Their goal is break even. If you look at the National Association of Public Hospitals and Health Systems, the average hospital in the U.S. has an operating margin of 7.2%. When you look at National Association Public Hospital members, it's about 2%. A lot of safety net hospitals are actually unprofitable, and they're very much dependent on federal as well as state and local subsidies to survive.
David Gruber, you're with Alvarez and Marsal Healthcare Industry Group, research director there, and you authored this new report on safety net hospitals. It's called Safety Net Hospitals at Risk. Lay out for us how things are going to change under the federal health care law.
Yeah, I think the changes are potentially dramatic, and we have to put the health care law in the context of health care delivery in the United States. And, you know, we spend 17.7% of the GDP in terms of health care. Our system is grossly inefficient and ineffective across the board. So now we take a subset of that, which is the safety net hospitals, and they're going to be challenged by a lot of things. The Accountable Care Act really focused on access and not cost containment. And so the first thing they did is increased access by raising the federal poverty limit from 100% to 133%. That will bring in about 11 million more people who will get insurance coverage. Paradoxically or unexpectedly, 26 states will take advantage of that, but there are 14 states that would not be expanding Medicaid, and there are a bunch still on the fence. Why is that an issue? Because there are also some other changes that are going to occur. One is in the ACA, you know, number one is there's going to be a reduction in Medicare DSH payments. Those are disproportionate share payments. Those go for you know, the hospitals that treat a disproportionate number of low-income people. There are roughly 3,200 hospitals that get Medicare DSH payments. More importantly is the significant reduction in Medicaid DSH payments. And that, about $10 billion spent in 2013, that's going to $5 billion. About 700 hospitals are dependent on that. And that's really meant for the low-income, you know, populations. Thirdly, there's going to be a reduction in the Medicare market basket. And historically, that's been at 2 to 3% a year in terms of growth. With the changes, it's probably going to go to 1 to 2%. So again, on the incremental basis, that's a significant change. You know, the fourth piece of this is the Medicare value purchasing. And I'm a big believer in what the CMS is trying to do in that regard. For those who aren't familiar with Medicare value purchasing, it involves three areas. Number one, it involves the readmissions. Number two, it involves hospital-acquired conditions. And number three, it involves patient satisfaction. And the way that works is that the goal here is to reduce readmissions, reduce the hospital-acquired conditions, improve satisfaction. If you're in the lower quartile of performers, then you pay a penalty. And to start, it's 1% of total Medicare revenues. It will go to 3% of Medicare revenues by 2015, 2016. Unfortunately, safety net hospitals are in the lowest quartile of performance in that regard. 31% of them either had the highest penalty or the next tier of penalty, and that cuts margins even further. And the last part of it is, and this is purely an unexpected consequence, if the uninsured people get insurance, now they're able to go elsewhere. So why go to the safety net if you could go to another hospital? So there's risk of volume decline as patients go from the safety net to other institutions. You put this together, what we have is what we call a tsunami of financial challenges. On top of that, we have states that are under economic distress, and we also have the federal government that's under economic distress. And you pull that together, we're running out of money and for hospitals that are very dependent upon subsidies, and the end result is tighter budgets.
David Gruber is our guest. He has a medical degree, also a business degree. He is the author of a new report looking at safety net hospitals, and the report says that those hospitals see more than 500,000 Medicaid patients each year. They employ 12,000 people and drive more than $700 million in economic stimulus into their communities. If you'd like to join the conversation about what the federal health care law or the Affordable Care Act, our guest has called it the ACA, will mean for safety net hospitals, you can give us a call. Republicans, 202-585-3881. Democrats, 202-585-3880. And independent callers, 202-585-3882. Dr. Gruber, you mentioned one thing that I want to put into more layman's terms, how hospitals essentially get rated, and the Affordable Care Act will really take into account what patient satisfaction and the general rating is of a facility. Here's the Washington Post. Safety net hospitals may have a tough time hitting the goals of satisfaction because they tend to receive lower patient satisfaction ratings than competitors who treat fewer uninsured people. So explain to us a little more in layman's terms how these satisfaction ratings will work and why they matter.
Okay. In terms of patient satisfaction, CMS has something called a Champus questionnaire. And what it rates is the user experience within a hospital. It asks a question, would you recommend this hospital to others as well? It looks at the quality of nursing care. It looks at your experience within the hospital. It looks at your interaction with physicians and the like. And so there's a rating that occurs at the end of the day. A couple of things to think about. One is you have to look at the population being served in some of the safety net hospitals. They tend to be lower income. There may be some literacy issues. There may be some language issues. They may have complex medical conditions, lifestyle issues. I mean, so there are a whole slew of what we call social determinants of health that really influence outcomes. A key part of healthcare is self-care, self-management, being aware on how to best take care of yourself. And the other part of it is on the other side is safety net hospitals are usually short on capital. They may not have the facilities that some other hospitals have. And so the net result is you have a more complex patient population coming into treatment. If they're acutely ill, they may have come through the emergency room. They may not have a primary care doc with a relationship, pre-existing relationship. They're in facilities that may be a little bit more overcrowded. They may not have the latest technologies. And then you go out and you have to rate your experience in that regard. So it's going to be more challenging. But the other piece to recognize is that quality in the past has not been a focus area of a lot of healthcare systems. And what CMS is doing with value purchasing is saying, look, we have to reduce the rate of readmissions. We have to look at that. Why are patients coming into the hospital? And then once they're discharged, you have to look at the transition from the hospital outside the hospital. The challenge for the safety net hospital is a lot of these patients don't have a primary care physician. So who do they go back to? Who do they monitor? How do we track them down? And that's a challenge.
Let's go to the phones and hear from Vince in Indianapolis on our Democrats line, speaking with David Gruber. Go ahead, Vince.
Hello. I just wanted to ask something about indigent care, because it sounds like the ACA wants to get rid of indigent care, number one. But number two, even the what you call the safety net hospitals also get a great majority of their funding through Medicare, and their revenues are about 80% of Medicare provides about 80% of their revenue. I know this from my accounting background and actuarial background in healthcare. So I just want to know what you think. Are they going to cut that back or what?
Yeah, you really have two questions here, right? One is, will they eliminate indigent care? The answer is no. You know, the intent is not to eliminate indigent care. You know, the problem is that we're running out of money. Medicaid, obviously, the federal government pays for 57% of Medicaid. The states pay for 43% of Medicaid. Many states are under a lot of pressure in that regard. So if you go to Louisiana, there's been some cutbacks. You go to Florida, there are cutbacks. You go to Illinois, there are cutbacks. So the first takeaway is that, you know, the federal government has a role, but the states also have a role, and the financial condition of the states really varies state by state. Secondly, yeah, they are at risk. A number of the safety net hospitals are at risk because they were very much dependent upon these subsidies, and some of these subsidies, as I mentioned, will be disappearing. For example, the Medicaid dish payments get cut from $10 billion to $5 billion. And when you look at institutions that have comparatively low levels of profitability or start at zero or somewhat negative, every single dollar makes a difference. Now, to your next point about Medicare paying 80% of the safety net hospital spending, that's not really the number. When you look at it on average, I would say Medicaid is probably about 35% or so. Medicare, you know, would be, you know, 25, 22, 25%. You have some commercial insurance at 18%. The big problem for safety net hospitals is that the commercial percentage at about 18, 19% is far lower than the average hospital, which would be about 35%. The reimbursement for Medicaid is roughly at, if Medicare is 1.0, Medicaid is about 90, 95% of Medicare, and the commercial insurance reimbursement rate is about 1.3, 30, 40% higher, and you get the cost shifting. So you have a couple of issues. One is, as the ACA goes into play, we have more patients covered under Medicaid. That's the lowest reimburser, so that would cause potentially some financial stress if it doesn't cover costs. And then secondly, from the commercial standpoint, it's a relatively low percentage of the total, and for the dollars that they do receive, they usually get reimbursed at far lower rates than other major hospitals within a given market. So the safety net is frayed, and in some states going to be particularly so, especially if they don't move forward on the ACA.
Steve's our next caller, Phillipsburg, New Jersey, on our Republicans line. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for C-SPAN. Dave, I have two questions. The first question has to do with the cost of health care. In Germany and Japan, they both have a fixed fee schedule. And also, my second question has to do with health IT and the fact that proprietary systems in hospital chains do not communicate with each other. And I just wonder the benefit of when you have when you have electronic health records, why they do not communicate.
Yeah, I think you asked two excellent questions. In terms of Germany and Japan, so the U.S. is at 17.6% of GDP in terms of spending. Germany and Japan, Germany is probably about 12%, Japan's about 10% or so. And despite the fact that those two countries have far older populations than we do, we spend a lot more money. You know, and why is that? Because we're, like I said, we have embedded inefficiencies throughout the system. We're inefficient, we're ineffective. We're highly fragmented. We don't do well in terms of transitions. We don't have good care coordination. Our prices are far, far higher in terms of pharmaceuticals. So there are a whole slew. The other thing is they're very much focused on primary care, much more so than we are in that regard. They have physicians that actually treat these patients, and they have single payer. You know, and single payer implies some price controls across the board. And what we do know is there's a significant disparity in prices between commercial and single payer. So Germany and Japan are much different. Their health outcomes are better than ours, and I'm sure there are things that we could learn in terms of what they're doing in terms of care delivery. In terms of healthcare IT, this has been a real big surprise, and I was a big supporter with the HITECH Act back in 2009. Money